Hello and welcome to Inside Judicial Watch. I'm your host, Amelia Kohen, and I'm sitting down with Bill Marshall, our senior investigator. Bill, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm glad to be here, Amelia. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So I'm here to talk to you today about the Associated Press having communications with the DOJ and the FBI concerning Paul Manafort's locker, his private storage locker. Now, can you go ahead and dive into this subject for us?
Sure. Well, actually, the meeting involved between the AP reporters, or four AP reporters, that took place on April 11th, 2017 with the FBI and DOJ. Actually involved more than just the locker. I mean, this is probably one of the more striking aspects of this meeting, was that the Associated Press was having this, what I consider a fairly extraordinary information sharing meeting with the FBI. Extraordinary in the sense that the AP reporters appeared to be giving what they thought was evidence of criminality to the FBI regarding a subject of their investigative reporting, Paul Manafort, who was, of course, at one time a Trump campaign official. At this point, this is April 2017, Manafort had been Trump's campaign manager for a short period of time back in 2016. He had left the campaign after some of Manafort's dealings with Ukraine became public, and he left the campaign. But what's extraordinary, I think, about this meeting that took place is that you have the AP appearing to give what they thought was evidence of criminal conduct on the part of Paul Manafort to the FBI, and almost suggesting to the FBI various criminal violations that Paul Manafort could be prosecuted for. Now, call me old-fashioned, but I don't really think that the role of reporters is to work with the government trying to get a private citizen prosecuted for anything.
Now, what were the developments that led up to this?
Right. Well, the press, the AP, and other media outlets were all over Paul Manafort. They thought they were trying to connect him to Ukraine. They were trying to connect Donald Trump to the Russians, of course. This was the big narrative being pushed by Hillary Clinton and her minions. And of course Christopher Steele and that whole operation that they had going of this where they were pushing this narrative that the Trump campaign was colluding with the Russian government, and the Russian government helped get Donald Trump elected. And by extension, the AP reporters were trying to dig up dirt on Paul Manafort and his dealings with the Ukraine, and by way of that, to connect Donald Trump to Russia. So they had this extraordinary information exchange meeting. Now, it's not unusual, I would say, for reporters to meet with law enforcement sources and to try to get information from them. What I think was extraordinary about this meeting was that you had these AP reporters trying to almost force a federal investigation, or create a federal investigation of a private citizen. But what generated the meeting was that, of course, the Associated Press was looking for new information for their stories that they were writing about Paul Manafort, who at that time, as you'll recall, was all the rage in terms of a news item.
Now, why did Judicial Watch go after these communications? Right.
Well, we have an excellent investigator, one of our top investigators, Sean Dunnigan. As you know, he's a terrific FOIA investigator. He had written a FOIA request on July 5th, 2018. He learned about this meeting between the Associated Press and the DOJ and FBI from public reporting. So Sean did what we do here. He sent a request to the DOJ for all records concerning that April 2017 meeting, including notes, reports that were generated by the FBI and DOJ, notes that were taken by the various officials that were present at the meeting, briefing materials, communications between the FBI and DOJ and anyone who was at that meeting, the AP reporters, as well as among themselves regarding that meeting. So this is what we do here. We oftentimes will learn about an unusual meeting like this that takes place, and we'll go after the government records that relate to them, because the government is nothing if not excellent at keeping records, right? The government runs on paper. And that's why the Freedom of Information Act, which we rely on so heavily, is so important, because it's sort of the soft underbelly of the government. It's our way of getting information out about the government's operations to the American people.
Of course. Now, to back up, who was actually in this meeting?
Right, you had 4 AP reporters. I believe it was, you had, I don't want to, there were 4 individuals. I don't want to name, I don't recall all their names offhand, but you had, critically, you had Andrew Weissman, who was head of the fraud section in the Department of Justice. Now, he's a critical player in this because Andrew Weissman is a somewhat notorious individual. He has been called the poster child of prosecutorial misconduct by none other than Sidney Powell, who's a terrific friend of Judicial Watch, a great attorney who's now representing Lieutenant General Michael Flynn in his case against the government. But Sidney wrote an entire book called License to Lie back in 2014, which devotes a lot of ink, if you will, to Andrew Weissman and discussing his really gross abuses of power as a federal prosecutor. And that begins at least as early as 2002, when Andrew Weissman was the deputy head of the Enron task force. And if you read Sidney's book, you will be shocked at the sort of the legal terroristic tactics that Andrew Weissman engages in as a prosecutor. He has suborned perjury. He will throw defendants into solitary confinement or supermax prisons in order to coerce their cooperation. He has systematically withheld what's called Brady material. This is evidence of a defendant's innocence, which is required to be turned over to the defendant and their counsel by the government, and he and his prosecutors routinely withhold that material. And this is really an egregious violation of a lawyer's code of conduct and federal prosecutors' ethics. They cannot withhold that kind of information.
Now, why would the FBI meet with AP reporters? That seems very
unusual. Well, the FBI meets with, and I say this as someone who formerly worked in federal law enforcement. I was an intelligence analyst for the DEA, many years ago, but I'm familiar with their processes. And as a civilian investigator, I'm familiar with. I have worked with the FBI and provided information to them over the years. The FBI will meet with anyone who may possess information of potential criminal conduct by someone. This is how they develop their cases. They get confidential informants, confidential human sources are typically used by the FBI to at least preliminarily assess a situation to decide whether it merits opening a formal investigation. They have various sort of gradations of investigations, if you will. Something can be a preliminary inquiry or an assessment where they're just looking at public open source information, information they're getting from leads, from as I say, from confidential human sources, that kind of thing. And they'll assess that and decide whether it merits opening a formal investigation and going down a particular avenue of inquiry. So in this case, the AP had their own agenda, if you will. They were looking for information upon which to base stories that they were writing about Paul Manafort, and they were hoping, and it's clearly indicated in the materials that we got, that they were hoping to get information from the FBI about the life and activities of Paul Manafort, so that they could, use those for their forthcoming stories. The FBI, to its credit, was not, at least according to the documentation we have, was not forthcoming with that information, as they shouldn't be, because the FBI has to be concerned about providing information to third parties at the risk of, because of the risk of interference with a criminal investigation. So the FBI typically, it's a one-way street. They'll take information, but they will rarely give it out. Now, we've seen exceptions to that, and most notoriously in the case of former FBI fired Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, who actually lied to federal agents about contacts he was having with reporters from the Wall Street Journal about the case. Actually, the case involved that he was eventually fired over involved disclosures that he made to the Wall Street Journal concerning the closure or possible closure of the FBI investigation into the Clinton Foundation. So the FBI selectively will leak information to the media. The issue, and it's sometimes that's sort of okay if it's seen to serve the interests of the federal government for some reason. If those leaks, as in the case of Andrew McCabe, are seen to serve his personal interests but not the interests of the government, that's a problem. And in his case, in McCabe's case, he compounded that by lying under oath to investigators who were questioning him about it.
What do you generally think of the FBI's relationship with the press?
Well, it's remarkable, the relationship with the press right now. Traditionally, the press has had somewhat of an adversarial relationship with the government and the FBI and the CIA. They were back in the 60s and 70s. Of course, the press was seen as taking on the FBI, right? They were the big boogeyman, and it was the job of the press to expose the supposed nefarious activities that the FBI or CIA were engaged in. And there was all kinds of activity back in those days. COINTELPRO was a program involving the FBI in which they were infiltrating domestic organizations to spy on them and so forth. So there is a healthy, I would argue, or there traditionally has been a healthy antagonistic relationship between the press in our country and government agencies like the FBI. What's unusual is that today we see the press working hand in glove with the deep state, if you will, the FBI, the CIA, these big agencies to help them cover up scandals. I mean, this is truly remarkable.
Can you repeat what you just said for everyone? How the deep state is being covered up?
Well, sure. I mean, we see that every day. You have this corporate media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the ABC, NBC, CBS, the usual suspects, if you will, who almost don't want information released about the FBI that could embarrass the FBI or James Comey, or Hillary Clinton. We're seeing these institutional actors like the FBI and its principals effectively being protected by the mainstream media. This is remarkable. I mean, I've been following politics for over 40 years, and I've never in my lifetime do I recall such a cozy relationship and disturbing relationship between the mainstream media in this country and these extraordinarily powerful institutions in our government.
This leaves the American people thinking, who can we trust? And they can trust Judicial Watch, is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and unfortunately, there aren't enough Judicial Watches out there. We need more organizations who are willing to take on these stories that aren't being covered by the mainstream media, and that because they're exposing uncomfortable truths about the corruption in the deep state, and it is massive. Our government has become so compromised in so many ways, largely by profit in many cases. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard, who I don't align with politically in many ways, I give her credit for calling out Hillary Clinton in such a blunt way that she recently did, calling Hillary the queen of corruption, if you want. I'm paraphrasing, but in essence, saying that she has sickened the Democratic Party, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, to Representative Gabbard's comments.
Now, to back up and to review what you just said, this is not the first time the press and the federal government has worked together and communicated in such a way. Is that correct?
No, there's always been, the press has always relied on confidential law enforcement sources. That's not unusual. That goes back, probably hundreds of years. You're always going to find people within the law enforcement community who, either for institutional reasons or personal reasons, will leak to the media. usually on, confident, without attribution, that sort of thing. But I think we're seeing now an alliance, almost unstated in many ways, where they don't even need to communicate. They know what they want to cover up because they want to cover up the same stuff. They want to cover up the corruption of the deep state and our government, and all of the profit making that goes on within the government and those that feed off of the government. The deep state is a term that it sort of has a conspiratorial air about it, but I think it's a very impactful phrase because it captures very well this notion of this embedded elite at the highest levels of the government and even further down in the government, not necessarily even at the highest levels, but even much further down, which have this self-interest in preserving and increasing their own power, and we have to be on guard against that. And unfortunately, the media, it seems, the corporate media has thrown in with them.
Now, I'm sure our viewers want to know, how did the Associated Press get the information to go inside Paul Manafort's locker?
Yeah, I don't know. We don't know that from the information we've obtained from the FBI and DOJ. Reporters have all kinds of sources. They learned that Manafort had this locker. I think it was in Alexandria. They got the combination somehow for the locker. I don't know how they did that. Who knows? The locker was being paid for by Manafort's company, which I think was called DM Partners. He was using, Manafort allegedly was using various shell companies to pay his various bills. One of the things that the AP reporters wanted the FBI to investigate was a $50,000 payment that Paul Manafort made to some men's clothing store. At what point in journalism's history did we get reduced to this, where the AP is trying to get the FBI to investigate a payment to a men's clothing store by a private citizen?
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't. I think what it reflects is this the partisanship of the media. This desperation to attack Donald Trump and anyone associated with him.
Now, what did the FBI and the DOJ find in that locker?
I don't know offhand. I don't. They raided the locker in May, approximately 6 weeks. This meeting with the AP reporters took place on April 11th. And I want to say they raided the locker, I think it was May 27th or May 29th. So about 6 weeks later, they raided the locker. I don't recall what they found offhand, if that's even known.
Did the FBI and the DOJ need a permit to get inside the locker because he's a private citizen?
Well, they would have gotten a subpoena. Presumably, it would have had a subpoena for Mueller's team. You have to remember, Weissman. This meeting with the AP happened before Weissman was hired by Robert Mueller, and Weissman effectively ran the Mueller investigation. We know that. Through some of my own reporting findings from records I got showed that Weissman was essentially making all the hires for Robert Mueller's team. And anyone who saw, I think, Robert Mueller's performance in his testimony before Congress would conclude that he did not have the mental capacity to run a complex investigation. Robert Mueller should be commended for his service in Vietnam 50 years ago. But from everything I've seen of him as a prosecutor in the last 20 years, he's done great discredit to himself. And he largely relied in the past 20 years in his public service on Andrew Weissman, again, who as Sidney Powell has described as the poster child of prosecutorial misconduct. I think that says it all. Weissman was essentially Robert Mueller's henchman, legal henchman.
Now, I'm sure the folks back home want to know, why exactly is the DOJ going after Paul Manafort?
Well, again, Paul Manafort was seen, I think, as a weak link for Donald Trump. The goal is always to get Donald Trump, and everyone should be clear. Paul Manafort. The FBI had investigated Paul Manafort years and years earlier, and some of his activities, and not found anything chargeable. But then suddenly he becomes Donald Trump's campaign manager, and he's viewed as a weak link, if you will, someone who could be pressured to turn on Donald Trump and give information to the federal prosecutors who have the ultimate goal of impeaching or removing Donald Trump from office. And of course, as the Mueller report, which I would really call the Weissman report, but the Mueller report concluded, there was no collusion between Donald Trump's campaign and Russia. This is one of the great myths that the deep state media has continued to perpetuate to this day. Some of them.
Mm-hmm. Now the AP told the FBI about payments made in a black ledger. Mm-hmm. What is the black ledger exactly?
Yeah, this was a document, a ledger, an accounting record of payments that were made to Paul Manafort from his lobbying activities for a Ukrainian political party called the Party of Regions, which was run by Viktor Yanukovych, who I believe was the president or prime minister of Ukraine. This is back in 2006, I believe, 2007, in that time frame. And the Party of Regions was considered to be pro-Russian. So again, this all goes back to an attempt to somehow link Donald Trump to the Russians.
It's just another attack on President Trump.
Yes, and they went. Of course, they pursued that angle in 6 ways from Sunday. That was the whole point of the Mueller, of the special counsel's team, investigative team, was to try to somehow desperately tie Donald Trump to Russian collusion. They found nothing, and unfortunately, in the process, they paralyzed a presidential administration, largely or partially, I would argue, for 2.5 or 3 years.
Why is Weissman considered to be Mueller's, quote, pit bull?
Right. Well, for the reasons I just cited, he is a legal terrorist of the first order, I would argue. And again, not to belabor the point, but Sidney Powell has done a magnificent job in her book, License to Lie, dissecting his tactics. Andrew Weissman's long history as a prosecutor is rife with truly abusive tactics that should concern any American. I mean, tactics that are worthy of East Germany during the Soviet era. I mean, throwing people into solitary confinement. We're talking white collar criminals, right? Who are not violent people, but putting them in supermax prisons. Or
why did he do that?
It's to intimidate people, to gain their cooperation, to turn them right against other defendants, right? So he's very effective in using these very coercive tactics in convincing defendants to turn on other defendants and to turn state's evidence. So this is what should be very troubling, and was certainly troubling to judges like Royce Lamberth and Emmett Sullivan in particular, in the example of Ted Stevens, Senator Ted Stevens' prosecution, is the government's withholding of Brady material. This is evidence that would prove the innocence of a defendant, which the government, under a court case called Brady, is required to turn over to the defendant, right? So if the government has evidence of your innocence and they're going after you, they're required to turn that evidence over to you and your attorneys. And Andrew Weissman is notorious for withholding this Brady material, they call it. In fact, Sidney Powell, in her representation of General Flynn right now, is battling for the government, for the court to compel the FBI and the DOJ to turn over, it's called exculpatory evidence, right? This is evidence that will prove the innocence of your client. She's filed motion after motion to get Judge Sullivan, who's overseeing General Flynn's case, to compel the DOJ and the FBI to turn this information over to her and to General Flynn. So this is one of the hallmarks of Andrew Weissman, is his failure to disclose Brady material. And it's not a small thing. It truly is not.
Mm-hmm. Now, my last question to you is this. Where does Judicial Watch go from here?
Well, we continue, we're investigating so many things on so many fronts. But in the Ukraine, I've got investigations out. I have opened into, for example, Burisma Holdings. This is Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son's company, the one that was being investigated by prosecutors in Ukraine that Joe Biden had fired because they were going after his son's company and potentially his son, right? We're looking at, I'm trying to get records from something called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States related to Hunter Biden's company, Burisma Holdings, as well as his China company called Bohai Harvest. We're trying to get records relating to former Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, who was a virulent anti-Trumper ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who President Trump had great difficulty firing, even though she was not supporting his policies. And in fact, she was thwarting efforts to gain the cooperation for DOJ, the U.S. Department of Justice, to gain the cooperation of Ukrainian prosecutors who were trying to get information to the United States. And so these Ukrainian prosecutors are trying to get visas even to come to the United States to present evidence about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden's corruption and Burisma Holdings. And she would not issue them visas to come to the United States. I mean, this is how beholden that Ambassador Yovanovitch was to Hillary Clinton, and how anti-Trump she was. Even though she nominally worked for President Trump, she was doing everything she could to essentially to hurt him. And finally, eventually, she was ousted from her position as U.S. ambassador. Well, so we're looking at that. We're trying to get her records. We are trying to get records related to Ambassador Yovanovitch's use of State Department personnel to monitor conservative figures in this country: Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity, Donald Trump Jr., Jack Posobiec, Dan Bongino, and others. I mean, and this is amazing stuff. And you have, a U.S. ambassador directing her employees in her embassy to investigate conservatives. I mean, so these are the kinds of issues that we're looking at. We're looking at, essentially any opportunity we see for Judicial Watch to obtain government records that will expose all the corruption in the Ukraine, among many of the Democratic leadership. I mean, I've been, truthfully, in the past, I had no idea of the corruption, and I follow the news obviously very closely, and I have for many years, and I had no idea that the Democratic Party was so heavily tied to Ukraine and to all these very, I would argue, corrupt contracts. You have Hunter Biden's son is just sort of the tip of, or Joe Biden's son is just the tip of the iceberg. And I think much more is going to be revealed as Judicial Watch obtains more and more records from the government.
Well, thank you, Bill, for covering the information that the media is refusing to cover.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for tuning in into Inside Judicial Watch. If you like this video, please visit our website, donate to our work, and find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Thank you.